Welcome. I'm Sebastian, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman with Father Michael Witt. We are in show number 42. We're very, very near the end of this program. Yes. And we've been talking about some not loveliest of times, and today's not a very lovely subject at all. We're going to be talking about the Bubonic Plague.
Yeah. When you look at the 100 Years' War, the Bubonic Plague, the mess that the papacy ended up in as a result of the papal schism, which we talked about at the beginning of the first series that we did on modern church history. These are rough times.
Yes.
And there are some heroes in this. So it just goes to show you that even in the worst of times, and you can't get much worse than the Bubonic Plague,
right?
That the spirit of humanity, and particularly Christian humanism, comes through, and those are just wonderful stars to see. You can't see the stars during the daytime. So it takes the deep of night, sometimes for the stars to come out. So
that's a nice way to look at it.
Yeah. We're going to start in the year 1346.
Okay.
And if you take the entire Eurasian landmass, just imagine from Ireland on the far west all the way to Japan on the far east, and if you go over to that western side, that's the year that the French get bloodied pretty badly at the Battle of Crécy. Okay? That's not the only warring that's going on, that 100 Years' War. That's not the only war on that Eurasian landmass at the time. Smack dab in the middle of the Eurasian landmass, okay, South Asia, you have a Tartar prince who is the ruler of a tribe called the Western Kipchaks.
Okay.
And he goes to war by invading Kyrgyzstan. That's one of those stands that used to be part of the southern belly of the Soviet Union. It's an Islamic state, and it's a very barren area with steppes, and it has lots of rodents also in that area. And this man's name is Janis Beg Khan, and it's his intention to expand his Tartar empire, and so he invades what seems to be an easy invasion area. Not a lot of people, but a lot of gerbils. And so anyway, his army is successful.
I don't think I'd fight him for that one.
For gerbils? Yeah, me neither. And when his army returns to him, they bring back something else they had not planned on, which was the Bubonic Plague.
Ooh.
And the plague is riding in the bellies of fleas. And the fleas are infesting the rats. And the rats are infesting the supplies, the supply train, the impedimenta that he brought in. Now, the plague is killing off people, but not at a huge number yet, and it's only when you bring a lot of people together that it really begins to exhibit itself, and this happens when he turned his attention to a port on the Black Sea, the city of Kaffa. Okay. Now, much of the Black Sea and the eastern part of the Mediterranean is being fought over, not necessarily militarily, but commercially, between two Italian rival city-states, one of those being Venice and the other one being Genoa. Kaffa happens to be dominated by Genoa.
Okay.
Okay. And Venice is looking for some way to undercut the Genoese.
Okay.
And what they do is they've allied themselves to Janis Beg Khan. So Janis Beg Khan now takes his Tartar army and sieges the city of Kaffa. Of course, then the losers on this will be the Genoese, and the Venetians will be the successors. Now, what we have is an account of the siege itself as the plague breaks out among the sieging Tartar army. And this comes from a an accountant, a Genoese accountant, who his name is Gabriel de Mussis, okay? And he says the following. I'm taking this from a really fine book called Epidemics by Marks and Beatty. Came out, I think, in the late 70s, sometime in the 70s, but it's a really good description of different plagues, but this is one, this chapter is chilling. Anyway, de Mussis' description here says the following. He says, infinite numbers of Tartars and Saracens suddenly fell dead of inexplicable disease, and behold, the disease invading all the armies of the Tartars every day. Thousands were killed. The humors coagulated in the groins. They developed a subsequent putrid fever and died, all counsel and all aid of doctors failing. The Tartars, fatigued by such a plague and pestiferous disease, stupefied and amazed, observing themselves dying without hope of health, ordered cadavers placed on their hurling machines and thrown into the city of Kaffa, so that by means of this intolerable passages the defenders died widely. Thus there were projected mountains of dead, nor could the Christians hide or flee or be freed from such a disaster. They allowed the dead to be consigned to the waves. Remember, this is a port city. And soon all the air was infected, and the waters poisoned, corrupt, and putrefied, and such a great odor increased. Wow. Well, it just became impossible, as you can well imagine, and so the Genoese decided to escape the city. They still had their ships, and so they got onto these galleys, and they sailed away through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea trying to get home. But as they did, of course, they brought the plague with them. And the plague also traveled through Central Asia. The Tartars continued dying, and they spread the plague through India and through the Persian Gulf and through the Red Sea, Asia Minor, Palestine, Egypt, and then onto Europe in that way too. So this thing was going all over this was a pandemic. This was all over the place. But the European experience of the plague itself can really be traced back to some 16 galleys that had made their way across the Mediterranean, carrying people back to Europe. 4 of those had come out of Kaffa itself. And in October of 1347, 12 of these 16 galleys landed in Messina, the port city in Sicily. Now, they had already landed in Constantinople, and Constantinople was being ravaged by the plague now. There had been a terrible plague earlier during the time of Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, and that had also wiped out a good portion of the city once before. But now here it happens again, and no one is immune. The youngest son of the emperor dies, and the emperor himself is so distraught over this that the Emperor John VI, Cantacorzanos, abdicated the throne. He just abdicated the throne, stuffed himself away in a room, and then wrote a history of the plague.
Wow.
In which he, in his own research, traced it back to 1320 to a group that he refers to as the Hyperborean Scythians. I'm not sure if that was the same group that they were talking about there. But it didn't take long for the people in the port city of Messina to recognize these plague ships, and immediately they forced them to leave. Well, it was still too late, and so Messina itself was hit. But the other thing about this is that as a result of forcing those ships to leave, then they spread the plague even further. And so by the time you get to November of 1347, one of those ships makes its way to Marseille, very important port city in southern France. Other ships end up in Barcelona, Valencia. And now the plague is spread to southern France and to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain and Portugal. By spring of 1648, it travels up the Rhone River to Avignon, which we'll talk a little bit more about, Montpellier, Toulouse, Bordeaux. All of these have been struck now by the plague. Other ships had gone to Corsica, Sardinia, spreading the plague there too. The Genoese ships that had arrived in Genoa were then sent out of Genoa, again too late. The plague had already hopped onto the shore, and from there it spread throughout parts of Italy, through Pisa, Florence, Bologna, Parma, and Piacenza. And this is the home city of this accountant that I had mentioned before, and he also talks about his own home city having been hit by this. I'd just like to read you a little passage of that also. He says this, "And thus the disease entered Piacenza. I do not know where I can begin. Everywhere wailing and lamentation arose. The bodies of the dead without number to be buried. There was inadequate land for the graves. They were compelled to make ditches by the piazza and the courtyards where never tombs existed. Infinite numbers of young people, especially pregnant women, died in a short time. The great and the noble were hurled into the same grave with the vile and the abject, because the dead were all alike. By day and by night they were led to the grave with a brief ecclesial office. One said, 'O Father, why dost thou abandon me?' Another, 'O Mother, where art thou?' Husband and wife were placidly shared. The marriage bed now were separated. And when the spirit left, the mother often refused to touch the child, the husband, the wife. The victim lay sick alone at home. The physician did not enter. The thunder-struck priest administered the ecclesial sacraments timidly. What are we to do, O good Jesus?" Wow. Wow, I mean, what a testimony, you know. Well, by the summer of 1349, all of France, Belgium, England, Scotland, Ireland, Denmark, Germany were now experiencing this horrendous plague. Then, by the end of that year, even Iceland, Greenland.
Oh, my goodness.
By 1350, its ravages have made its way to Sweden and Poland. It was held off in Poland for a long while. Poland tried to quarantine itself, but even that was unsuccessful. And then in 1351, Russia itself. You could not go anywhere and get away from this thing. Despair gripped Europe. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote at this time his famous work, The Decameron. And he wrote it in grief because of his father's death in 1348. There was no medical security. People were hiding from each other. Another quote from yet another important author of the time was Petrarch, and he writes this in the city of Parma in 1349. He says, "Where shall I turn? Everything is woe, terror everywhere. You may see in me what you have read in Virgil of the great city, with everyone tearing pain, everywhere fear, and the manifold image of death. Oh, brother, would that I had never been born, or that I had already met my death." Wow.
Wow.
The first sign of a problem in Avignon, remember the papacy had been moved to Avignon by this time, and the first sign came when almost an entire monastery of Carmelite monks died. I mean, in a matter of days, 66 monks died. And shortly after that, some 7 cardinals died. Pope Clement VI directed the efforts, and one of the first things he did was to consecrate new cemeteries. And immediately, 11,000 burials took place.
Oh, my gosh.
In days.
Oh.
This was in days. As quickly every cemetery of every church, every graveyard, every cemetery of every religious order was entirely filled up within a matter of days. And so in absolute desperation, the Pope went down to the Rhone River and consecrated the Rhone River as sacred ground, and the bodies were then thrown into the river.
Oh my gosh.
And then carried off. The Pope himself, under the guidance of his personal physician, had 2 giant bonfires lit on either side of his throne. And these things burned day and night. And the physician said, "No, you're too important to die in this. You need to direct the efforts, and these fires will keep you safe." Well, they did, because they were so hot. No one would come anywhere near the Pope, and obviously all the rats would keep away from him too. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think he lost a lot of weight, but then he did survive the plague. Word came that in Paris, the priests, he mentions about the thunderstruck priest in Piacenza. In Paris, they weren't thunderstruck. They got out of Dodge. The diocesan priests fled out to the countryside, which did not necessarily save them. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, as Paris was denuded of its regular clergy, of its diocesan clergy, the religious orders stepped up to the plate, and they actually went in to the city in order to minister to the people as they were dying. I can tell you, it had to have been incredibly scary. One time I delivered last rites to a woman in a hospital dying of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, mm-hmm. that mad cow disease. Mm-hmm. And I had to put on this moon suit, and the doctors were we weren't really sure what this thing was. I can tell you it was a scary experience.
I'm sure that is frightening.
Yeah. I mean, early on, I remember before I was ordained, talking to priests about the first couple years of experiences of anointing AIDS patients and not knowing themselves whether this was contagious or not. The doctors themselves were scared to death. The doctors and nurses were scared to death of this thing, not knowing how it was transmitted. So you can imagine how these people felt. Another example, the sisters at the Hotel Dieu opened themselves up to the plague victims, and just as much as the accountant had talked about families not having anything to do with each other, husbands leaving their sick wives, mothers leaving their sick children, these sisters took these people in and cared for them in the last couple days of their lives. Remember that this is a pneumonic plague, so that when people sneezed on them, they would definitely catch it. Yeah, catch it themselves. Boy, the medical faculty at the University of Paris gathered together to try scientifically to come up with some answers to how this had happened, and they came to the conclusion that the plague was caused by the planetary conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars within the sign or the star field of Aquarius.
Darn planet.
Well, so much for science.
Yeah, that's right.
Others had other answers, a little more hands-on.
Yeah, I hope so.
And many of these, since medicine couldn't protect them, and the church had not succeeded in appealing to God to abate this this terrible plague, there were people who took it upon themselves to do it instead. And so they began gathering together. The most famous group is called the Brethren of the Cross, and sometimes referred to it as the Brotherhood of Flagellants.
Okay.
And what these guys would do, and there were hundreds of them, and ultimately thousands of them. It was a loosey-goosey kind of a group, but they would gather themselves together and then march from city to city which is probably not a real smart thing to do either, you know. But anyway, that's what they did. And they would go into a town singing chants, and these would be chants of mourning, okay? They were dressed in long robes, and the robes had red crosses sewn on them. So in that sense, they looked a little bit like crusaders, okay?
Right.
But they're wearing these long robes with cowls over their heads. And these cowls were large enough that it would hide their eyes, which were downcast. So they looked like they were going into in mourning, okay? And they carried with them an instrument that the Romans had invented many years before called the flagellum. The scourging of Christ was used. They used the flagelli for that. And what it was 3 cords tied together on a stick, and then on the far end, the end of those cords were little iron points. Okay. Any male was permitted to join, only males, but any male was permitted to join these groups if he had the permission of his wife. Okay, and this meant that he would then leave for 34 days, a minimum of 34 days. He had to sign up for 34 days, and he would receive a modest stipend in order to live on during that period of time, and he would then perform these penances, which I'll read a little bit about in a minute. And besides the laymen, they also permitted priests to join, but they were not allowed to have leadership roles, and the secret councils were restricted from them. Only the lay. So this is truly a lay movement. Okay? And then they would perform this penance twice a day. And again, I turn back to that book, Epidemics, as it describes what this penance was. Okay? I'll quote again. Penance was performed twice every day, in the morning and evening. And they went abroad in pairs, singing hymns amid the ringing of bells. And when they arrived at the place of flagellation, they stripped the upper part of their bodies and put off their shoes, keeping on only a linen dress, reaching from the waist to the ankles. They then lay down in a large circle in different positions, according to the nature of their crime. The adulterer with his face to the ground, the perjurer on one side holding up 3 of his fingers, etc., etc. And then they were castigated, some more and some less, by the master, who ordered them to rise in the words of a prescribed form. Upon this, they scourged themselves amid the singing of psalms and loud supplications for the averting of the plague, with genuflections and other ceremonies of which contemporary writers give various accounts, and at the same time constantly boasting of their penance, that the blood of their wounds was mingled with that of the Savior. One of them, in conclusion, stood up to read a letter, which it was pretended an angel had brought from heaven to St. Peter's Church in Jerusalem, stating that Christ, who was sore displeased at the sins of man, had granted at the intercession of the Holy Virgin and the angels that all who should wander about for the 34 days and scourge themselves should be partakers in the divine grace. Whoa.
Wow.
You know, pretty powerful stuff, pretty weird stuff. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it's almost a scene from one of those Monty Python
Almost.
films. You know. But this was not innocent play.
No, they were doing what they could, or what they thought was the right way to stop the offer of sacrifice.
Yeah.
To,
And of
and the
course,
plague.
this kind of activity is going to, I mean, this is pretty heightened activity. It's going to bring out the weirdos out of communities, too. You know, that kind of stuff is marginal. And eventually what's going to happen is that these people are, or some of these people are going to be so on fire with this stuff that they're going to start looking around for somebody else to flagellate. And the obviously the target there is going to be those people in the community that stand out. And particularly we're talking about the Jews of Europe. And this all stems really in Switzerland. There's a little town called Zofingen, and in Switzerland, and there was a vial of poison that was discovered near the town well. Now, there had already been rumors going around that this plague was not actually caused by the alignment of the planets, but rather it was some kind of an international conspiracy to kill off Christians in Europe. Now, who would be doing that? Who could get away with that? And so then you have these conspiracy theories about an international Jewish plot to do this. And so what happens then is that several the Jews in Zofingen are rounded up and arrested. Now, not too far off, over on Lake Geneva, Jews already had been arrested at the little town of Chillon. And these Jews had been taken in, and they were tortured, and they confessed to having poisoned the town. Well, under torture, you're going to do anything you can to make the torturers stop. But this becomes a theme, and so town after town begins to do this. In Bern, in Switzerland, in Freiburg, also. And by late 1348, people are in a panic. Many of them believe this thing about the Jews poisoning the city wells, and so many people in Europe began putting out pots and pans and whatever they could to receive rainwater, and they would only drink rainwater. And city gates were locked up. To get into a city was a difficult thing. I mean, they all had city gates, but now they were very, very careful. And if you weren't from that town, good luck trying to get in. In Basel itself, the people panicked, and they went to the town officials and demanded that all the Jews in the city be rounded up. And out of fear of this mob, the city officials did that. They rounded up all the Jews in the city of Basel, and they put them into a wooden building and set it afire and killed all those people. The word of this gets around, and throughout Switzerland and throughout parts of Germany, people began doing the same thing. These terrible pogroms of Jews being killed. Reports eventually make it their way to France and to Avignon itself. Pope Clement V, when word gets to Avignon that this is what's being done, what he did was he flatly protected all of the Jews in his jurisdiction within Avignon itself. He ordered, as the monarch of Avignon, that no one would do this to the Jews of Avignon. And then he sent out on 2 different occasions ecclesial bulls, letters, condemning any assault on the Jews. They both of these were roundly ignored all throughout the Christian world. The Emperor Charles IV also tried to do the same thing. And in his case, he had more than just a trick up his sleeve. He had a sword up his scabbard. And when he issued a similar order that no Jews throughout the Holy Roman Empire were to be harassed because of this plague, and it was ignored, he looked around for an example. And a clear, easy example were the nobles in Bohemia. They were rounding up Jews and burning them. They were setting fires to the ghettos, and they had a very clever reason for doing this. Many of those nobles had borrowed large amounts of money from Jewish lenders, money lenders, and this was one way of wiping out their debt.
Right out that.
So, the Emperor Charles ordered Duke Albert of Austria to take an imperial army and march it to Bohemia, and then to burn the castles of all those nobles who had burned the ghettos of all those Jews. That got people's attention. But even so, it is still, you might be in authority, but you're not necessarily in control. And even at the imperial castle itself, at Kyberg, the emperor had ordered that the castle be opened up to the Jewish population in that area, and hundreds of people went into this castle. And you know, you think you'd be safe in the emperor's castle, and peasants from all over the countryside attacked the castle, got in, and slaughtered all of the Jews in the imperial castle itself.
Oh my gosh.
One of the other princes, Prince Rupert van der Pfalz, also offered to protect the Jews of the Pfalz area, you know, the northern Rhine area, and but he was not as magnanimous as the emperor. He promised to protect them for a fee. Well, obviously, you know, you pay whatever you could to keep away from these mobs, and so he then brought into some of his castles those Jews who were willing or able to pay him for protection. But in the end, Prince Rupert himself is attacked by the local people who called him the Jew master, that is to say, the protector of the Jews. Over on the other side of Europe, in the east of Europe, Duke Boleslav V of Poland sees all of this happening, and he sent out an invitation to the Jews of Europe to leave and to come to a rugged land and to settle in a rugged land that was his to populate, and that being the country of Lithuania. It's one of the reasons why you have a significant Jewish at least until the Holocaust, a significant Jewish population in Lithuania. Many of these were Western European Jews who then made their way under the protection of the King of Poland the Duke Boleslav to Lithuania. Talking about the King of Poland itself, this is King Casimir the Great, also opens up Poland and invites Jews of Western Europe to come. Again, one of the reasons why up until the 1940s, the largest Jewish population of Europe was in Poland. So there you have, this absolute irrationalism that's happening, and as a result, so many Jewish people being killed in this. There's other examples of rationalism going out. For one thing, you have the death of so many rational people.
Right.
You know, think about this. These are the great universities are in the great European cities, and so there's a huge dying off at the universities themselves of faculty members, theologians. Many of them are priests, and many of them are order priests, and philosophers. And so remember, this is the age of Thomas Aquinas. The Summa Theologica is being studied by all of these people, and now that had just been written a generation earlier, and now those people who are teaching it and are studying it are dying off in such huge numbers. And the end result is that what takes its place is going to be things like very weird mysticism. I'm not talking about the solid Christian mystics, but the weird mysticism. Witchcraft is going to show its ugly head again. Satanic cults, and then there's this whole thing of the dance of death. You visit any European museum during this period that has artifacts from this period, and you find some of the most morbid things. Of some of the woodcuts of skeletons dancing around. You find jewelry. People were wearing jewelry of skeletons, of skulls. I remember one of the most beautiful ivory carvings I've ever found is a coffin and an ivory skeleton in this coffin. It's kind of shocking, you know. The one positive sign of this is going to be the spread of the cult of Saint Sebastian. And the reason for that, of course, is that Saint Sebastian is it was that Roman soldier who ultimately, a member of the Praetorian Guard, who, when his fellow soldiers found out that he had converted to Christianity, they took him out and they shot arrows in him. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that's so important is because of that evening song, psalm, though 1,000 fall at my side and 10,000 at my right side, near me it shall not come. They're speaking in terms of those arrows coming down. So people experiencing the plague, those who survived the plague, and remember that 2/3 of Europe did survive the plague, but as they're seeing people fall to the left and to the right of them, and there's no particularly apparent reason for this person going and that person not going, there was a sense that through the intercession of Saint Sebastian, they were somehow being protected from those terrible arrows. As I said, many of the clergy were lost at this time, and certainly the urban clergy, the university professors who were clergy, many of them died as a result of administering the last rites. This being a pneumonic plague, the possibility of coming in contact with human fluids is pretty strong. Whole monasteries were depopulated. If it got into a monastery, it wiped that monastery out for all practical purposes. What comes then is in the next generation, the next couple of years, particularly among diocesan clergy, with such a reduction in the numbers, then you have new priests who are being ordained very quickly, but with very low standards. Mm-hmm. They'll have very little preparation. There is less education, and certainly no spiritual formation, no priestly formation. And this then is just going to exacerbate a bad situation to begin with.
Right.
You know, by October of 1349, Pope Clement finally had enough with the flagellants, and so he condemned the movement itself and told people to go home and stop doing this sort of ad hoc kind of stuff that they were doing. Even so, when monasteries find themselves being attacked by the plague and then literally being closed down, the few monks who survived the plague could not maintain the monastery, and so in many cases these monks themselves left the monastery and became itinerant preachers, just kind of going around, and some of them ended up joining the now outlawed flagellants. Because of their experience, and because they were now in disobedience to the Pope, many of them turned sort of like renegades, and they turned against all church authority. And so now you have these bands of flagellants and monks and farmer monks literally going to other monasteries that were still functioning and attacking them, going into churches and defiling churches, setting them to fire, destroying the altars, the hosts, beating up the priests, going into convents and just destroying the convents, the episcopal residences. These people had taken their religion and turned it upside down, mm-hmm. and now they were attacking church authority. The church now was just very rapidly moving toward its own crisis, and this is, this really was now the autumn of Christendom As we began, remember, we began the modern series. We spoke about the autumn of Christendom. This is really not the autumn of Christianity. Christianity
Right.
survives, but Christendom itself, that concept of that community, really now has some very, very difficult times. The issues, the events taking place were beyond any one person. No pope could have reversed this. No pope. Innocent III couldn't have done it. Nicholas I couldn't have done it. Gregory the Great couldn't have done it. No individual could have done this. No saint, no individual saint, no religious order. There was no Cluniac order that could reverse this at this time. The Franciscans couldn't do it. The Dominicans couldn't do it. They couldn't do it all together. The Carmelites couldn't do it. Nobody could do that. There is no institution, no nation, nothing in Europe that could reverse the disintegration that was happening, and it was absolutely searing. Think about these questions. How could you mourn the loss of one out of every 3 people who died within 10 years? It just, your family's wiped out. Everything you've lived with and for is just gone. 1 out of every 3 people dead within 10 years. People are so weak they can't even bury the dead. Horrible scenes of bodies being placed in shallow graves and then dug up by feral dogs in packs. Wow. How do you stop the senseless killing that was called the 100 Years' War? That was all happening at the same time that this plague was happening. And no one knew how to stop it. It had gone beyond generations. How do you get Englishmen and Frenchmen to see themselves as Christians, not just as Englishmen and Frenchmen, objects to kill, but rather as Christians, and willing to give their lives to God rather than to the king? Here you have now the rise of the nation state, the rise of nationalism, which is going to plague us all the way down to the 20th century, certainly. How do you get the church together again? How do you return the Pope to Rome? That's going to be the great effort of St. Catherine of Siena. How do you get people to live lives of holiness? How do you reform the Curia? In Avignon, I mean, even saints looked at Avignon and what they saw in the Curia, the offices that ran the central authority of the church. What they found were lawyers, canon lawyers, and accountants. How do you change that? How do you fill those monasteries again? So those were some of the great questions that we find ourselves having to deal with, and there's no easy answers to any of this. In the meantime, while the church is trying to grapple with all of these issues, Europe itself went on a spending spree.
Oh my gosh!
Now think about this. Now 1/3 of the population of Europe had died.
It's gone.
Yeah, somebody inherited that 1/3 of that wealth, and so as a result, there are some very, very wealthy people who just fell into this.
2/3 that are left, they can better spend it now. I could be next.
And that's the theme. That's that dance of death. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. Or a very well-known statement back in those days was, Timor mortis conturbat mei. The fear of death confounds me. So I'll stop thinking about it. I'll go off and have a good time. In some parts of Europe, the inflation rate actually rose to 400%.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. There was so much money around and so few goods that people just went crazy. Even the poorest European now had stuff that he had not had before. And what you begin finding, historians who study this particular period, we're talking about the last part of the 1300s and going into the early 1400s. We always look at the 1400s and say, oh, Renaissance. Yeah. But even in the last part of the 1300s, you're going to find peasants who are now taking their benches that they've been, in their huts. They've had benches, and and getting rid of those and having chairs instead. Even peasants are going to have chairs. There'll be a fireplace in every home. Now, that never happened before, but fireplaces, you begin finding those. Even peasants are going to have plates to eat off of. Rather than a wooden bowl, they're going to have plates. And not just plates, but they're also going to have utensils. Everybody is dressing better. By the time you get to 1400, the European generally is dressing better than what he had dressed before. More Europeans are wearing silk than they'd ever worn before. More are wearing linen than they'd ever worn before. Now, there's still a lot of people running around in wool, and they will for many centuries, But still in all, even poor people were finding themselves with linen clothing. They could afford to have at least one linen shirt. Now, here's an interesting thing. Linen wears out a lot faster than wool.
Definitely.
You can have a wool shirt for years. Get yourself a good Pendleton and it'll last forever, But linen wears out. What do you do with linen cloth after it's worn out? Well, here's the interesting thing. You take that linen down to, or actually a guy comes around and gets it, and he buys it real cheap, okay? And then he takes it and he takes a piece of wooden block with nails on it, and he shreds it. Okay, it's called a carder. People whose last names are Carters, that's what their ancestors used to do. They used to card the linen, and then you would take it and you could turn it around and respin it, and you end up with another linen cloth. That's called shoddy. Okay. The second that you have virgin wool or virgin linen, then you got shoddy. Now, interestingly enough, there's enough of this linen pulp around that someone came up with the idea of taking this stuff and putting it onto a screen, okay, and with liquid, and spreading it out real thin, and then putting a lot of pressure on it. You know what you have?
Paper.
Paper. That's right. And so, as we go into 1400. We now have paper, and we don't have to use parchment anymore. And so now we have the beginnings of that whole revolution that's about to take place. So what we're finding here is that as we're going into 1400, after having gone through this horrible experience of the 1300s, what we're finding is two modern isms, and besides nationalism and these other isms, two modern isms that are below the radar screen for many centuries, but they're going to have a lot of influence on the way Western civilization develops. And one of those is consumerism, and the other is secularism. And those two things are going to have a tremendous influence on the development of Western civilization. We're at the point now that modern civilization is about to replace medieval civilization. Okay, and what we're talking about, that era we're talking about right now. And I'll just say this, that the West wasn't necessarily trading up when it traded the one old model in for the new model. And Teresa, when we come back one last time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to look specifically at medieval history, and I'd like to call this the idea of Europe. Okay, because Europe is closely tied, the idea of Europe is closely tied to the concept of Christendom. And Christendom is the social expression of Christianity. And for us to lose that idea of Christendom, of Europe, of Christianity is a very dangerous thing for us to do. And I have three sources I'm going to be drawing from in this last lecture as we complete our course of medieval church history.
Something that we all will obviously need to take note of.
Yes.
Very relevant to current. All right, Father, thank you so much. What a painful chapter there.
We should have warned everyone not to listen to this on a full stomach.
That's right. 1 in 3 died from the bubonic plague.
And that plague will be with us in various forms almost every summer for a couple centuries.
And all came from Kyrgyzstan.
Yes. Yeah. Central Asia.
Yeah.
It's still there, by the way.
Is it? They still have it.
Yeah, the bubonic plague is still around, and every once in a while it flares its ugly head up. In fact, not too many years ago, there was a scientist, and I think he was at a university in California, who accidentally pricked his finger while doing some experiments with the bubonic plague, and he died from it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tough life.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Father, and look forward to next week's program.
Okay.
I guess I'll look forward to it.
I hope so.
Once again, I look forward to listening, but I don't look forward to it being our concluding program for this series.
Darn it.
But all right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Shall we close with a prayer and a
Let's
blessing?
do. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
And may Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.